Hello and welcome to today's 50-second webinar in the On the Move webinar series, 7 Best Practices to Effective Spare Parts Management, brought to you by Honeywell Intelligrated. I'm Tracy Niehaus, Director of Marketing for Honeywell Intelligrated, and I'm your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. You may ask an online question at any time throughout today's presentation in the Q&A feature along the right side of your screen. Simply type your question into the text area and hit send. Questions will be addressed at the conclusion of the presentation, with the exception of technical questions that can be asked and will be answered real time. Please note that we recommend that you be hardwired when attending this webinar. A Wi-Fi connection may result in lag times in slides updating and graphics loading. Today's webinar will include polling questions. Please feel free to answer these questions when they appear and be sure to click submit so we can include your response, as we will be sharing the results real time during this live event. If you'd like to revisit key sections of today's webinar, it will be available on demand at sps.honeywell.com by clicking on the resources link under the automation support section in a few days after this live event. And you'll also receive an email in a couple of days with a link to the recorded event. Now on to the presentation, 7 Best Practices to Effective Spare Parts Management. Discussing today's topic will be Cindy Linus, Director, Parts Commercial Excellence. Cindy has 25 years of experience managing customer service teams in industrial environments, including 15 years in warehousing and distribution. She is responsible for overseeing Honeywell Intelligrated's parts business from distribution, purchasing, and inventory control to spare parts proposal generation and customer support. Cindy is a member of the American Production and Inventory Control Society and earned a bachelor's degree from Rutgers University. And with that introduction, the webinar will now begin.
Thank you, Tracy. Hi, I'm Cindy Linus. I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk to the audience about the things I've learned in my many years of doing this work. Material handling equipment, it's a large investment, but after the initial equipment is purchased and installed, then the real work starts with the maintenance team keeping these huge systems and machines continuously running. You need to have parts on site for quick change-outs when component failures occur. Otherwise, you risk downtime, particularly if the failed part is on a critical path of your operations. Nobody that's ever run a facility wants to get caught with shutting down operations due to not having a $50 part. My discussion today is going to center on 7 best practices for effective parts management. We're going to discuss the importance of a CMMS system to track your maintenance and parts usage, purchasing the recommended spare parts list from the OEM. You might hear me refer to it as RSPLs, but it stands for Recommended Spare Parts List, setting a realistic budget going forward so you're not caught short on funding dollars, keeping your parts cage organized so you always can find your items, keeping track of your parts inventory for continued accuracy, utilizing the offerings from your vendors, and keeping your maintenance staff trained on your systems.
All right, so as mentioned, we do have polling questions. We're going to go ahead and move to that first polling question in the webinar today. Do you use a computerized maintenance management system, a CMMS, or an enterprise asset management system, an EAMS? We'd just like all of our attendees to answer either yes or no.
Yeah, I'm going to be curious to see what the response is. I have my suspicions. The real question, which we'll get into maybe a bit later, is going to be, if you have it, how accurate do you keep it? Do you keep it up to date? Things like that. So that's what we're going to start delving into as well. People might think of, when you hear EAMS, you might also call it an ERP system. That could be SAP or Oracle, but some way to manage your inventory and your maintenance. That's what the question really is. Okay. Well,
okay, so the results are up.
Yeah, 70% have one. That doesn't really surprise me. I'm also going to go into the presentation to talk about the folks that don't have one. So don't panic if you're of the 30% that doesn't have one. There are methods to do it. And again, the critical thing is, if you have one, it's going to be, do you keep it up to date? So I'm going to start moving into more of the presentation. So CMMS systems, if you have one, that's what I'm talking to right now. In addition to using it to scheduling regular maintenance, CMMS system is an excellent tool for managing your parts inventory. You have the ability by asset to identify and capture your parts spend. You can set minimum quantities, so when your inventory falls below the OEM recommended on hand, you'd receive a signal to place an order. But on the flip side, you can also set max quantities to ensure your inventory does not creep up. I'm sure there's a lot of financial people that look to see what your inventory is, so you got to watch that too. It's a very important tool. It basically allows you to manage your maintenance and maintain your data integrity. Now, in the event for the 30% of the folks that do not currently have access to a CMMS system, there's still methods to manually manage your inventory. You could use an Excel spreadsheet and make sure to add the items listed. We have the items on the left of the slide listed to make sure you have it in the Excel. And even in the event if you don't have Excel savvy personnel, you can still do it the old-fashioned way with paper templates. The key to all of this, whether it's CMMS, an Excel spreadsheet, or paper templates, you've got to keep it updated with your inventory movement. On this slide, I've got an example of what a manual inventory spreadsheet could look like. The OEM, actually, I suggest get in touch with them. They can help you put it together and use the recommended spare parts list as a base. Then, once you've got it set up and loaded, you could use a simple pick ticket system where when your maintenance team, they go to pull a part off the system and replace it with something from your spares kit, they just write down what part they used, the location they took it from. Then either they could update it or give it to your parts clerk for entry into this Excel spreadsheet or something similar to this. Now, point number 2, the best way to know what parts you should actually keep on hand is by using the recommended spare parts list provided with the original equipment purchase. So when you buy that initial equipment, you will get a recommended spare parts list to tell you what parts you should have on hand. And if that was years ago and you don't still have a copy, the OEM will be able to provide it to you. Now, these lists are created when the OEM reviews the equipment that is installed, and they determine what parts are critical to always have on site. Often the OEM will load the recommended list on a web portal for your review. On this slide on the right, the example here displayed is our recommended list of spare parts list. And it's actually, in this example, it's broken down by asset. We have that on a portal, which will help the maintenance team determine what part is on each asset, and you could build your new orders based on that. Now, once you have your recommended spare parts list, you should really periodically compare that to what you actually have on hand. Over time, your on-hand inventory can veer from what was originally recommended. So by comparing, it will help you identify any gaps that may have accumulated over time between what is on hand versus what the OEM recommended. You can then work this gap into your budget and start to build your parts cage back up to the original recommendations.
All right, that brings us to our next polling question, and that is, have you ever had to wait to buy parts due to a budget constraint? And again, simple answer, yes or no. We'd like to see the same level of participation again. That was great with the first one.
Yeah, I'm curious to see this one too. I mean, one of the biggest issues I hear about in my position is you know, the maintenance staff, they understand they need more parts, they need to keep parts on site, but they often didn't budget, you know, maybe enough dollars to get the approvals to purchase it. So curious to see how the audience responds to this. Yep, doesn't surprise me. Good for the no's. You didn't have to wait. You weren't held up, but 60% of the audience has run into those problems where they know they need certain parts, and because they didn't put it in their budget, you know, especially if they're over budget, they're going to have a really hard time getting approval to buy those parts unless it's a complete downtime emergency, and we want to avoid that. So, getting back to the slides, it might be challenging to predict exactly what you will need in the upcoming year. It is difficult, but there are some simple methods that will get you probably 95% of the way there. First of all, work with the OEM. Use their knowledge on what annual spend they would expect to see in your size facility. If you have a CMMS system or ERP system, use it. Observe your usage in the past year and couple years, and plan on using that usage as a base, but then also increasing the budget dollars as your system ages, because you will see more parts failures as the systems get older. It's also recommended to have an annual assessment from the OEM to determine how the equipment and components are wearing, and if there are recommendations for the upcoming year that you could start to budget. Now, what I've got here is something interesting. I've actually used this for years, and it works. This slide, it shows a method of predicting a 10-year span of parts budgeting for a typical distribution and fulfillment type operation system. So I'm going to use an example here. So let's say you have a $10 million piece of equipment that you originally put in. You're probably going to have about a $200,000 initial recommended spares list to go with that $10 million system. So if I use this chart, you know, your first year is going to be warranty. You're not going to spend that much money on parts. You might need to budget a bit for wear items like belts and O-bands. But then in this example, year 2 post-warranty, what this is saying is use your initial recommended spares list, which was $200,000, and assume that in year 2, you're probably going to spend about 2% of that $200,000, which is $4,000. Go to year 6, you can estimate 25% of your RSPL of $200,000. You're going to spend about $50,000. I've done this multiple times and in many scenarios, and it's pretty close. It'll get you pretty close. I actually personally predict my future planning to keep stock in-house based on these kind of calculations. There's one caveat to this model, though. It does not account for unexpected issues. So, for example, if a box on your sorter splits open and the contents destroy a section of the sorter, this could add unforeseen expenses to repair that damage on the sorter, or if your fork truck plows into your conveyor, you know, that's not in this model. So you do also need to budget some contingency dollars for any unexpected damage. In addition to your standard maintenance, it always is a good practice to periodically, typically annually, bring in the OEM to assess the equipment. This is usually a relatively inexpensive service and provides critical information about the health of your equipment. You'll receive a report of any high priority issues that may require immediate attention. You'll receive a detailed review with photos as well as a parts list of items that are recommended to change out before they fail. If the issues do not require an immediate attention, then this is also another great tool to budget repair work. that might be needed in the upcoming year. Now, the fourth best practice is to have an organized parts cage. It does need to be in a segregated location to keep the parts together and also allow easy access for the maintenance staff. Although I would recommend some large distribution centers, they often found that multiple cages located strategically with specific parts closer to that specific equipment, it can save time and footsteps. Keep it clean and use location IDs and labels to identify the parts in your parts cage. An example here shows one of the best practices with labeling. I suggest you use magnets on your labels so that it's always there. If you use barcode scanning, you could print those barcodes right on the label and then scan it and then hit the number of quantity that you took out of the location. I would also suggest using a visual cue on the label to indicate if this is a critical part. This provides another indication that this part needs to be in stock on your shelf. In this example, we used a red dot to indicate it was a critical item. Your OEM will know which items are critical, and you should work with them on help providing the labels as you set up the parts cage. So let's talk about how to set up your parts cage if you're a greenfield site. And so everyone on the audience knows greenfield, brand new site, new equipment, everything's shiny, spanking new, right? But as you lay out your building space, this is early on, you do want to plan for a dedicated area for your spare parts. The OEM can help you review the spare parts list and actually estimate how many and what size storage bins or racking locations you may need. This can include pallet racks, small bins, and areas for cabinets, similar to like Bidmar cabinets. If you don't have any employees with the expertise of setting up a parts cage, usually the OEM can provide drawings, kind of like the one pictured right here, based on your space and your needs. You'd also work with the OEM to ship you the parts in pre-stocked cabinets, which will always, if you work with them, they could already label it. And all you need to do is roll the cabinet out. It'll have the parts in place, labels on for what the items are, and just roll it right into place in your parts cage. When the parts do arrive on site, it is critically important to validate the receipts and check the parts into your CMMS, or if you don't have one, into the spreadsheet. This is going to set up your parts cage for ongoing success. It's critical to start it right at the beginning. Now, what happens if you have a brownfield? For anyone who doesn't know, a brownfield is an existing site. It might have been used for years. They're just adding a new piece of equipment to it. It's actually a more common situation than a greenfield site. So you've got years of parts cage maybe not being kept up as good as it should be. So it might take some time to get the parts cage back into good shape. What I suggest you do is first start with a physical inventory, get rid of any previously used parts. You don't want old warranty parts mixed in with your good new stuff. And mark down what you have by part number, quantity, and current location. That's probably the minimum of what you need to keep. Add location markers to your racking and bin locations like I showed on the prior slide. And if you don't have them, maybe they're missing, you used to have them, they fell off. Keep your critical parts marked and in an easily accessible location. You don't want to be searching for those critical parts when you need it. Like I said before, do not store failed parts in the same location as your new parts. I've seen that happen too often. You need to quickly, once a part fails, you really should quickly be working with the OEM. And if they're still under warranty, ask for a warranty. Return the parts if that's what you're required to do. Or if you're not under warranty and the parts don't work, don't keep them on your cage. Don't clutter it up. It doesn't help anybody. You don't want to waste time and add risk by putting a defective part back on your system. And if you're upgrading or modifying a section of your system, keep any parts needed for that project in a separate area waiting for the mod so that they're not pilfered for general maintenance.
All right,
Now,
so that brings us to our last polling question. And it is, what type of inventory accuracy practices do you employ today? And you can choose all that apply. Check-in, check-out processes, annual physical inventory, cycle counting or random checking, and finally, nothing. We pray the parts we need are on the shelf.
Yeah, and it sounds like kind of a joke question, the last one. Don't be embarrassed. I've asked these questions of many maintenance managers and teams, and they sometimes don't have something in place. They know they need to. It's not just that they're like, oh, I'm crossing my fingers, but there's a lot of scenarios where I wouldn't be surprised if I say some people legitimately picking nothing, and that's okay. There's ways to do it. All right, 14% brave people admitted that they don't have anything, which is, again, did not surprise me to see that at all. So, I mean, I'm going to start with the top one. You know, the best one is obviously, I recommend at a minimum to do an annual physical inventory of your parts cage. It's critical. It's important. And it might be hard. You might have parts there that have been sitting there for years without labels, but the OEM can help you identify those parts, but you have to start taking account. Once you take account, if you do the annual physical, make sure to adjust your ERP or CMMS or your spreadsheet to those updated counts. Cycle counting, you could also set up cycle count checking. What this does is it takes a section of your parts cage, and by running reports from your CMMS or pulling a section of your Excel spreadsheet, you just send a team member to count that subsection area and see if the physical location matches what your system or your Excel spreadsheet says. Many customers actually prefer this method versus a physical inventory because it takes less time than a physical. You just want to make sure that over a period of time you're counting every single place, not just the more frequently used ones, because often that's where you'll find the critical part. Someone just stuck it in a strange place. Once you've confirmed the accuracy of your inventory, what I would recommend is then you do an inventory analysis. And what that is to do this, you take your original recommended spares list from the OEM, and again, you could always go back to the OEM if you don't have it, and compare that to what you have in stock and identify the gaps between the list and what you have, and then make plans to order the missing parts, paying particular attention to those critical items. Number 6, make sure to partner with value-added vendors, not just someone that's happy to sell you the part at the lowest price and then not be there when you need them. These vendors, they should know your equipment. They should be able to help you in emergencies, including tech support and overnight shipments of critical parts. They should have a 24/7 phone availability and offer same-day shipping and expedites. You need a vendor that's going to be with you in the middle of the night helping you resolve these issues. The 7th and final best practice is to rely and trust in your maintenance staff. They're key. Their jobs are to keep your systems running, and this cannot be done if you don't have the parts that you need. They need to be trained and encouraged to keep the parts cage adequately stocked and inventory accurate. Train them on these best practices, and more importantly, listen to them. Listen when they're having issues and work to enlist the aid of the OEM to help resolve these issues. Heavy turnover, that's a problem. I mean, we've all seen it, particularly you might have seen a lot post-pandemic, post-COVID. And when there's turnover, all the training and knowledge about your system can walk out the door with that existing employee. So ways to combat this, it's standardize your training across all your sites. Always include parts training in your onboarding process. Be consistent with corporate training videos and documents. You could also reach out to the OEM. They often have specific system trainings, either classroom or if easier online, that can be used for continuous training of your team. So we're coming to the conclusion of this presentation. The 7 best practices are outlined and repeated on this page. Have a system like a CMMS to track your inventory. Review the recommended spare parts list from your OEM. Budget your parts spend for the next few years. Organize your parts cage and make sure you have good inventory processes. Partner with good value-added vendors and make sure to continuously train your maintenance staff. So, all right. Thank you. I hope that helped, and I think we might have a couple minutes left for some questions, Tracy.
We do, Cindy. Thank you again. That was a really informative presentation. And as Cindy mentioned, we are going to move on to the Q&A portion of our event, be it a little brief. As a reminder to all of our attendees, you may ask an online question in the Q&A feature along the right-hand side of your screen. And Cindy, we have a few questions that have come in, so let's try to get to some of those. My first question is, rather than keeping all the recommended parts in our inventory, doesn't the OEM keep stock so that we can just pull from them in the event of a failed part?
Yeah, actually that's a really good question. I get that a lot. It's tempting. It's very tempting. It helps you guys keep your costs in check. But here's the reality. You can't always depend on a supplier or the OEM to have the item in stock. It may not, first of all, it might not be a stocked item for OEMs. We have to make decisions on which items, what are the fast-moving items that we need to keep in stock, but not every single item stocked even for the OEM. And even if it is a stocked item, there's no guarantee that another customer might not come in the day before and purchase the last piece of stock, and then the OEM has to, reorder and get the product in. So you can't rely on the OEM having the stock at all times. That's why we strongly recommend keep a parts cage, keep your critical items in stock, use it to replace a failed part, and then replenish your parts cage with new orders from the OEM or from your vendor.
All right, let's try to squeeze one more question in here. Why would I need to know the OEM's lead time if it is an item that they typically stock?
Yeah, and that's something most OEMs will and can provide you. OEMs use algorithms to base stock on historical usage and forecasts. But like I just said before, there could be times multiple customers might buy it all at once and that stock's used up. So you might have to wait for the OEM's lead time before their stock is replenished and shipped to you. So again, what I would say is I'd recommend pay really close attention to those long lead time items. And again, the OEM can share that with you. So typically anything that's greater than 10 days, even if it's a stocked item for the OEM, but if they say their lead time is 10 plus days, absolutely you need to make sure you have that item on hand, particularly if it's a critical item.
All right, well, that is all the time we're going to have for questions today. Thanks, Cindy, and thank you so much to our attendees for their participation. And if we were unable to answer your question during today's live event, we will send you a response via email. And as a reminder to our attendees, within the next few days, you can access this presentation on demand at sps.honeywell.com by clicking on the resources link under the automation support section. You'll also receive an email with a link to the presentation, as well as a link to our white paper titled The Value of OEM Genuine Parts versus the Cost of Generic Parts. On behalf of Honeywell Intelligrated, thank you for attending today's On the Move webinar. We hope you can join us for our next webinar series in late August, early September. Registration information will be available at sps.honeywell.com in resources under the Automation Support section soon. Have a great afternoon.